In the heart of the Wild West, danger didn't always come with six guns blazing. Sometimes it came on the morning mist, a whisper carried on the wind, a desperate cry that could change a man's life forever. A lone cowboy, riding the edge of a still lake, was about to find himself tangled in a web of honor, greed, and a secret that men were willing to kill for. This is a story you think you know, but you don't. Stick with me, because every turn gets darker, and the truth hidden at the bottom of it all will leave you breathless. The sun was a pale coin in the sky, spilling weak light over a world holding its breath. The air smelled of pine and cold, damp earth. The lake was a sheet of dark glass. Jace Holleran let his stallion Gideon pick his way along the trail. He wasn't a man who rushed. Out here, rushing got you killed. Patience was a shield, and silence was a language he understood better than most. He tipped his hat low, his eyes scanning the mist coiling off the water. A place this quiet always had a story to tell. A lake this still always had secrets. The creak of his saddle leather was the only sound for miles. A wolf howled, far off, a lonely sound. But then he heard something else. Faint, almost lost in the vastness. Then it came again, sharper this time. A woman's voice, cutting through the morning calm. "They stole my clothes, Cowboy. Please help me." Jace went still. Every muscle in his body locked up. His hand by instinct fell to the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. This wasn't the wind playing tricks. He scanned the water, his eyes narrowed to slits. And then he saw her. A figure, waist deep in the freezing water, half hidden by the fog. Her hair was long and black as a raven's wing, plastered to her shoulders. She was an Apache woman, and she was in trouble. Her voice rang out again, no longer just desperate, but laced with a fury that burned hotter than any sun. "Please." "They took everything." Jace felt a cold anger rise in his chest. An anger at the cowards who would do this. His horse shifted under him, sensing the change. Jace's knuckles were white on the reins as he scanned the shoreline. Boot tracks. Fresh. Too fresh. Whoever did this was close. They were probably watching. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. A rock in the middle of a storm. "Easy now. You ain't alone anymore." Her eyes, dark and proud, met his across the water. And in that one single moment, Jace Holleran knew his wandering days had just come to a violent end. The mist swirled around her like a ghostly shroud. Jace swung down from Gideon, his boots sinking into the soft mud at the lake's edge. The woman in the water didn't cower. She didn't hide. She stood there, waist deep in the cold, her chin held high, with a fire in her eyes that dared him to look away. She would rather drown than show weakness. "They mocked me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "They laughed while I bathed, then ran like the dogs they are." Jace knew the type. Men who found their strength in preying on the vulnerable. He'd seen their kind in dusty border towns, fueled by cheap whiskey and their own rotten souls. But seeing the result of their cruelty, standing before him, proud and unbroken, it coiled something tight in his gut. "Name's Jace Holleran," he said, his voice a low rumble. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect she hadn't been shown by the others. "Reckon those fellas don't know the kind of trouble they just stepped in." Her eyes, sharp as obsidian chips, studied him. She was weighing him, measuring his intent. "And you, Cowboy," she challenged, her voice hard. "Why do you care? Why not just ride on?" Jace met her gaze without flinching. A man's worth less than the dust on his boots if he hears a cry for help and does nothing. The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the gentle lap of the water against the shore. A long moment passed. Then her lips softened, just a fraction. "Nia," she said. Her name was a quiet breath in the cold air. "My name is Nia." Jace gave a single sharp nod. It was a promise. "Well, Nia, we're gonna see to it you walk out of this lake with your head held high. No man's got the right to take that from you." But as he said it, he saw something else in her eyes. It wasn't just humiliation. It was fear, a deeper fear than just being shamed. She wasn't just worried about her clothes, she was terrified about something they took with them. Jace didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his heavy duster coat, the one that had seen him through countless storms and dusty trails. He laid it carefully on a sun-warmed rock near the shore. It was a simple act, but in a world of taking, it was a statement. "For you, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "so you ain't left shivering." Her eyes flickered from the coat to his face, a hint of suspicion warring with her desperate need. She gave a tiny nod, a gesture that felt as heavy as a treaty. Trust was a rare currency out here, and it wasn't spent lightly. Jace turned away, giving her privacy, his gaze sweeping the tree line. He could feel them. The Watchers. The cowards. Men like that. They didn't just run. They savored their cruelty. They'd stick around to see the final act of the humiliation they'd started. He crouched, examining the tracks in the mud. 2 sets of boot prints. Heavy. Careless. They hadn't been gone long, and then he saw it. A third set of tracks, much smaller, almost lost in the others. A child's tracks. They weren't just tormenting a woman. There was a child involved. "They're close, aren't they?" Nia's voice was a whisper from the water. "Too close," Jace muttered, his jaw tight as a fist. The story was changing, getting darker with every detail he uncovered. He stood and looked back at her. "You stay put. A person ain't meant to walk out of a lake draped in shame." He saw a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, a crack in the wall of her pride. Before she could speak, he was back on Gideon, the stallion's muscles coiled tight, sensing the storm coming. He followed the tracks into the deep shade of the pines. This was never just about stolen clothes. It was about a line being crossed. And now, with the hint of a child's presence, the line had been drawn in blood. Behind him, the lake was quiet. Ahead, the trees whispered of violence. And Jace Holleran rode straight into it, because some things a man just can't ride away from. He found the clothes tossed carelessly in a thicket of sagebrush, a final insult. But as he gathered the simple deerskin dress and moccasins, he noticed something was wrong. There was a small beaded pouch that should have been with them, a medicine pouch by the look of it, but it was gone. And the ground around the clothes was scuffed up, disturbed. They hadn't just thrown the clothes here. They'd searched them. They were looking for something specific. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. This was a robbery. A cold chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept down Jace's spine. He rode back to the lake, his mind racing. The sun was higher now, burning the mist off the water. Nia was standing on the bank, wrapped in his duster, a small, proud figure against the vast wilderness. She looked up as he approached, her eyes searching his face, and he knew she saw it. The new, darker question that hung in the air. He dismounted and set the bundle of her clothes on the rock beside his coat. "Found what they took," he said, his voice low. She knelt, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the familiar fabric. A piece of her life, reclaimed. But her eyes shot back up to his, wide with a silent, frantic question. "The pouch," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My son's pouch. It's not there." Jace's gut twisted. A son, the small tracks. It all clicked into place. "They took it!" she choked out, a sob finally breaking through her composure. "It holds his birthstone. Without it—" She trailed off, her gaze turning toward the trees, filled with a terror that made Jace's blood run cold. This wasn't about tradition. This was something else. "What happens without it, Nia?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. She looked at him, her dark eyes swimming with tears. "He is sick. The stone. The medicine man said it is the only thing that holds the fever at bay. Without it, he won't last the week." The stakes had just been raised from honor to life and death. The men who did this hadn't just humiliated a woman. They had just sentenced a child to die. Nia dressed quickly behind the cover of the rocks, her movements sharp with urgency. The dignity she'd clung to was now overshadowed by a mother's fierce, desperate fear. She emerged, no longer just a victim, but a warrior. Her eyes, once filled with shame, now burned with a righteous fire. "They went north," she said, pointing. "Toward Black Creek Canyon. They have a camp there. I've seen their smoke." Jace nodded, already swinging into Gideon's saddle. He looked down at her, at the raw courage etched on her face. This wasn't his fight, not by blood, but it was now. A man is defined by the battles he chooses, and Jace had just chosen his. "Most men would have left me," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "Most men ain't worth the leather they walk on," Jace replied, his tone grim. "Let's ride." He expected her to ask to be taken to her village, to her son, but she didn't. She looked up at him, her chin set with grim determination. "I am coming with you." Jace started to protest. It was too dangerous. But one look in her eyes silenced him. The fire there was not something to be argued with. It was the fire of a mother who would walk through hell itself for her child. He reached a hand down to her. "Hold on tight," he said. She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and he pulled her up to sit behind him on Gideon. The horse, sensing the gravity of the moment, stood rock steady. As they rode, the sun climbing higher in the sky, a new, unspoken bond formed between them. It wasn't about gratitude anymore. It was a partnership forged in crisis, fueled by a shared purpose. They were two people against a cruel world, riding toward a canyon where faceless enemies held a child's life in their hands. Every hoofbeat was a second lost, every mile was a prayer. But as they rode deeper into the wilderness, Jace couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Why would two common thieves care about an Apache child's birthstone? It had no value, not to them. Unless they weren't common thieves at all. Unless someone had paid them to take it. The trail to Black Creek Canyon was rough, a scar carved into the land. Jace pushed Gideon hard, the big horse eating up the miles. Nia held on behind him, her silence a heavy weight. She didn't speak of her son, but he could feel her fear in the tight grip of her hands on his waist. The sun beat down, turning the air thick and hazy. Jace's mind was working, turning over the pieces. The stolen pouch, the searching. It didn't add up. These men weren't just cruel, they were following orders. As they neared the canyon, the smell of wood smoke reached them, faint but unmistakable. Jace reined Gideon in, sliding from the saddle. "We go on foot from here," he whispered. "Stay behind me." Nia slid down, her moccasins making no sound on the rocky ground. She moved with a grace and silence that spoke of a life lived in tune with the land. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. The cold, hard steel felt familiar in his hands. It felt like justice. They crept forward, using the boulders and twisted juniper trees for cover. The camp was small, just a single fire pit and two bedrolls. The men were there. One was a big, brutish man with a scar that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer. The other was wiry and nervous, his eyes constantly darting around. They were laughing, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth. And there, sitting on a rock near the fire, was the beaded pouch. "That's them," Nia breathed, her voice filled with venom. "The big one is Harlan Pike. The other is Colt Avery." Jace nodded, his eyes fixed on the pouch. The plan was simple. Get in, get the pouch, and get out. But simplicity had a way of getting complicated out here. Harlan took a long pull from the bottle, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Can't believe Croft is paying us this much for a worthless Indian rock," he slurred. "Said it was the key to getting them off that land for good." Jace froze. Croft. Silas Croft. The name hit him like a physical blow, a ghost from a past he thought he'd buried. Croft was a land baron, a vulture who circled dying ranches and picked them clean. He was ruthless, powerful, and the man responsible for the death of Jace's father years ago. This wasn't a coincidence. This was fate, cruel and twisted, bringing his past crashing into his present. The fight for Naya's son had just become intensely personal. It was about more than just a sick child now. It was about vengeance. Harlan Pike laughed again, a ugly grating sound. The old shaman told him the kid's spirit is tied to that rock. With it gone, the boy dies, and their will breaks. They'll scatter like quail, and Croft can just walk in and take the whole valley. Jace's blood ran ice cold. It was a plan of unimaginable cruelty. It wasn't just robbery, it was a calculated act of terror, designed to break a people by killing their most vulnerable. He looked at Naya. Her face was a mask of horror and grief. He saw his own quest for justice reflected in her eyes. He won't win, Jace whispered, the words a solemn vow. Not this time. He cocked the Winchester. The soft click was the only sound in the world. It was the sound of a reckoning about to begin. The sun dipped low, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood orange and deep purple. Jace moved like a shadow, his Winchester held ready. Nia was right behind him, silent as the falling dusk. The plan had changed. This wasn't about sneaking in anymore. This was about a message. He stepped out from behind the rocks, the rifle leveled. "Evening, boys," he said, his voice as cold and hard as the canyon stone. Harlan and Colt scrambled to their feet, their hands flying toward their pistols. They were drunk, and their movements were clumsy. "Who in the hell are you?" Harlan snarled, his eyes narrowed. "Just a man who disapproves of your business practices," Jace said calmly. "Hand over the pouch." Colt looked terrified, his eyes wide, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold his gun. But Harlan just grinned, that ugly, scarred sneer spreading across his face. "You in what army, cowboy?" "This ain't your affair." "You made it my affair when you decided to let a child die for a piece of land," Jace replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He saw a flicker of something in Colt's eyes. Fear, yes, but also shame. The wiry man hadn't signed on for this. But Harlan felt no such conflict. That half-breed whelp? The world's better off without him. Now get out of here before I put a hole in you. That was it. The line was crossed. Jace's finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance, Pike. Give it up. Harlan laughed and went for his gun. He was fast, but whiskey had slowed him down. Jace was faster. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, the explosion echoing through the canyon like a crack of thunder. Harlan staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed into the dust without another sound. Colt yelped, dropping his own unfired pistol as if it were a hot coal. He stared at Harlan's body, then back at Jace, his face pale with terror. I didn't want this," he stammered. "I just needed the money. Croft, he—" "I know about Croft," Jace cut him off, his voice like ice. He walked forward, never taking his eyes off Colt, and scooped up the beaded pouch from the rock. He turned and handed it to Nia, whose hands were trembling as she clutched it to her chest. She looked from the pouch to Jace, her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. Jace turned his attention back to the terrified man cowering by the fire. "You have two choices," Jace said. "You can ride out of this territory and never look back, or you can stay here and join your partner." Colt didn't need to be told a third time. He scrambled away, tripping over his own feet, and disappeared into the twilight. He was a coward, not a killer. Jace let him go. He had bigger problems now. He had Silas Croft. As darkness settled over the canyon, Jace looked at Nia. The first battle was won, but they both knew the war had just begun, and Croft wouldn't send drunken thugs next time. He'd send killers. They rode through the night, the moon a silver sliver in the vast, dark sky. Nia held the pouch like it was the most precious thing in the world, which to her, it was. Jace could feel the tension leaving her body with every mile they put between themselves and the canyon. But a new tension was building in him. Silas Croft. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in 10 years. A name that tasted like ash in his mouth. He had run from that name, from that past, trying to outride the ghost of his father's murder. But the past had a long reach. Naya's voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "You knew that name. Croft." It wasn't a question. Jace didn't answer for a long moment, the rhythmic beat of Gideon's hooves filling the space between them. "He's the man who took everything from me," he finally said, his voice rough. "My family's ranch, my father's life. He uses lawyers and money and fear to bleed people dry. And when that doesn't work, he uses men like Harlan Pike." Nia was quiet, absorbing this. Their two separate worlds, his and hers, had just violently collided, drawn together by the gravity of one evil man. "We cannot run," she said, her voice firm. "He will not stop. He wants our valley, the land of my ancestors. He will not stop until he has it, or we are all dead." Jace knew she was right. Running was what he had done before, and it had solved nothing. It had only delayed the inevitable. "No," he said, his own voice filled with a new hard resolve. "We're not running. We're going to stop him." The words felt strange on his tongue, but they also felt right. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't just drifting. He had a purpose, he had a direction, and it was pointed straight at the heart of Silas Croft's empire. "How?" Nia asked, the single word hanging in the night air. "A man like that. He is protected by the law, by money." "Then we'll have to find a law he can't buy," Jace said grimly. "We need proof. Something that connects him directly to Pike. Something that will stand up in front of a federal judge." He knew it was a long shot. Men like Croft were masters at covering their tracks. But as he thought about it, a new idea began to form. Colt Avery, the coward who ran. He had been terrified, but he had also been ashamed. Maybe, just maybe, his conscience could be an ally. "The man who ran," Jace said, thinking aloud. "Colt. He's our only link." But even as he said it, he knew the odds were slim. Croft wouldn't leave loose ends. A man like Colt Avery was a liability, and Silas Croft had a very specific way of dealing with liabilities. Jace spurred Gideon on, a new urgency gripping him. They had to find Colt before Croft's other men did. It was a race against time, with justice on one side and a shallow grave on the other. They reached Nia's village at dawn. It was a small, quiet place nestled in a green valley, a world away from the violence and greed of men like Croft. As they rode in, people emerged from their lodges, their faces etched with worry. An old woman rushed forward and took Nia in her arms, relief washing over her features. Nia spoke quickly in her native tongue, and all eyes turned to Jace. They were not hostile, but wary, studying the white man who had ridden in with one of their own. Nia led him to a lodge where a small boy lay on a soft fur bed, his face flushed with fever. This was her son, Little Hawk. Nia knelt beside him, untied the pouch, and placed the small, cool stone on his forehead. She began to chant softly, a mother's prayer. Jay stood at the doorway, feeling like an intruder on a sacred moment. He had fought for a life he had never seen, for a family that was not his. And looking at the sick child, he knew he would do it again. He would see this through to the end. An old man with eyes as wise and ancient as the mountains approached him. He was the shaman. "You have brought hope back to our people, Jace Halloran," he said, his English slow but perfect. "Nia has told us of your courage, but the snake, Croft, is not so easily defeated." "I know," Jace said. "I need to find the man who escaped. Colt Avery. He's the key." The shaman nodded slowly. "The path of vengeance is a dangerous one. It can consume a man." Jace met the old man's gaze. "This isn't just vengeance anymore. It's about justice. For my father, and for your people." The shaman studied him for a long moment, then a slow smile touched his lips. "Then you will not ride it alone. Our best trackers will help you. They can find a whisper in the wind. They will find this Colt Avery for you." Jace felt a surge of gratitude. He was no longer a lone rider against a powerful enemy. He had allies. As the trackers prepared to leave, Nia came out of the lodge. There were tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "The fever," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It is breaking, The stone. It is working. She stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. You saved my son's life. Jace just nodded, his throat too tight for words. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance. With the trackers fanning out into the wilderness to find Colt, Jace knew their next move had to be to the town of Redemption, the town Croft owned, body and soul. It was time to walk into the snake's den. The ride to Redemption was tense. Jace and Nia rode together, two warriors from different worlds, united by a common enemy. Redemption wasn't much of a town. It was a dusty street, lined with false front buildings, all of them bearing the mark of Silas Croft, from the saloon to the land office. The law was a squat brick building with a sign that read, Sheriff Bodine. Jace knew the name. Bodine was Croft's man, a sheriff who served his master's interests, not the law's. Walking into that town was like putting his head in a noose. We need to be smart about this, Jace said as they reined in on a ridge overlooking the town. We can't just walk in and accuse him. He owns everyone and everything here. Nia's eyes scanned the town below. Then we do not walk in. We watch. We listen. A snake always leaves a trail. She was right. They couldn't force a confrontation. They had to wait for an opportunity. A mistake. They made a cold camp in the hills that night. As they sat by a smokeless fire, one of the Apache trackers appeared out of the darkness like a ghost. He had news. We found him, the tracker said, his voice a low whisper. The one called Colt. Jace leaned forward, his heart pounding. Where is he? The tracker's face was grim in the firelight. He is in the ground, a single bullet in his back. He was buried in a shallow grave not 5 miles from here. He was silenced. A cold dread washed over Jace. He had been too late. Croft had cleaned up his loose end. Their only witness, their only link to the crime, was gone. Despair, sharp and bitter, threatened to overwhelm him. They had nothing. Croft had won. Nia saw the look on his face. She placed a hand on his shoulder. No, she said, her voice fierce. A dead man can still speak. They were clumsy. They were in a hurry. Did you search the grave? The tracker nodded. He was buried with everything in his pockets. They did not even take his money. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. This was in his shirt pocket. It is a bank draft. Jace took the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. It was a draft for $200, drawn on the Bank of Redemption. It was made out to Harlan Pike. And at the bottom, in neat, elegant script, was the signature that had haunted Jace for 10 years, Silas Croft. It was the proof they needed, a direct financial link between Croft and the man who had tried to steal the medicine stone. It was everything. But then Jace looked closer. The draft was countersigned on the back by a second party, authorizing the payment. The signature was sloppy, almost illegible, but Jace recognized it. Sheriff Bodine. The law in Redemption wasn't just looking the other way. The sheriff was an active partner in Croft's crimes. This conspiracy went deeper than he had ever imagined. He's not just on the payroll, Jace said, his voice a low growl. He's a conspirator. He's as guilty as Croft. Now they had a choice. They could take this draft to a U.S. Marshal in the next territory, a journey that would take weeks, giving Croft plenty of time to disappear or destroy them. Or they could confront the beast in its den. They could use this piece of paper to tear Redemption apart from the inside. The townspeople, Nia said, her eyes gleaming with a strategic fire. The ranchers and farmers Croft is squeezing. They live in fear of him, but they must hate him. If they saw this, if they knew the sheriff was a criminal, they might be willing to stand up. It was a huge risk. It could spark a war right in the middle of Main Street. But it was their only chance to get justice, not just for themselves, but for every person Croft had ever wronged. Tomorrow, Jace said, his decision made. We ride into Redemption, and we show them who their sheriff really is. As the tracker melted back into the night, Jace and Nia looked down at the lights of the town. It looked peaceful from a distance, but they knew it was a powder keg, filled with fear and resentment. And they were about to walk in and light the fuse. The next morning, they rode into redemption. They didn't ride in like fugitives, heads down. They rode in tall, side by side, their faces set like stone. People on the street stopped and stared. An Apache woman and a grim-faced stranger riding together was not a common sight. They were making a statement before they even spoke a word. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Jace looped Gideon's reins around the hitching post. He looked at Nia. "You ready?" She gave a single, sharp nod. Her hand rested on the hilt of a knife tucked into her belt. They walked in together. The office was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke. Sheriff Bodine was sitting behind his desk, a big, beefy man with a florid face and small, piggy eyes. He looked up, and a flash of surprise, then annoyance, crossed his face. "What do you want?" he grunted, not bothering to get up. "We're here to report a crime," Jace said, his voice calm and even. He stepped forward and placed the bank draft on the desk. "Murder." Bodine glanced at the paper. His eyes widened almost comically, and the color drained from his face. He looked from the draft to Jace, then to Naya, and a greasy sweat broke out on his forehead. I don't know what this is," he stammered, trying to shove the paper back at Jace. "It looks like a payment for services rendered," Jace continued, his voice dangerously low. "Services that included robbery and resulted in the death of one of your deputies, Harlan Pike, and your key witness, Colt Avery." The sheriff's bluff collapsed. Fear, raw and naked, was in his eyes. He started to reach for the gun in his desk drawer, but Jace was faster. In a blur of motion, he leaned across the desk, grabbed Bodine by the front of his shirt, and hauled him halfway out of his chair. The Colt Peacemaker was suddenly in Jace's other hand, the muzzle pressed against Bodine's sweaty temple. "You're going to tell me everything," Jace hissed. "Everything about Croft. Or so help me. This office is going to need a new sheriff." Bodine began to blubber, his bravado gone, replaced by the pathetic whining of a cornered rat. He started talking. He confessed everything. How Croft had hired Pike and Avery. How the plan was to steal the medicine stone to break the Apache tribe's spirit. How Bodine himself had sent a man to silence Colt Avery when he heard Pike was dead. He spilled every dirty secret, every crime, every single detail of Croft's reign of terror. As he talked, a crowd began to gather outside the office, drawn by the commotion. They peered through the window, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. Jace let Bodine talk, his voice getting louder and more frantic, until the whole street could hear his confession. When he was done, Jace shoved him back into his chair. He turned to the crowd. "You heard him," Jace said, his voice ringing with authority. "Your sheriff is a murderer and a thief, in the pocket of the man who is strangling this town. Are you going to let them get away with it?" A murmur went through the crowd. Years of repressed anger and fear were starting to bubble to the surface. Just then, Silas Croft himself appeared, flanked by two hard-faced gunmen. He had heard the noise and had come to see what was happening. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man with cold, dead eyes. He saw the scene in the sheriff's office, heard the angry muttering of the crowd, and a look of pure fury crossed his face. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice like cracking ice. Jace stepped out of the office, the bank draft still in his hand. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is the meaning, Croft. Your little scheme is over." Croft's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he snarled. He nodded to his men. "Kill him." The two gunmen drew their pistols. The crowd gasped and fell back. But before they could fire, a blur of motion came from the doorway of the sheriff's office. Nia had thrown her knife. It spun end over end, a flash of silver in the sunlight, and buried itself in the throat of the gunman on the right. He gurgled, dropping his gun, and collapsed to the ground. At the same instant, Jace drew and fired. His shot was perfect, hitting the second gunman square in the chest. He was thrown backward, landing in a heap in the dust. The street was suddenly, shockingly silent. It was just Jace and Croft, facing each other in the middle of the street, the bodies of Croft's men between them. Croft was unarmed, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The townspeople, who had been cowed for so long, now found their courage. They surged forward, their anger finally unleashed. They surrounded Croft, their faces hard, their voices rising in a furious chorus. The reign of Silas Croft was over. It had ended not with a legal battle or a marshal's warrant, but right here, in the dusty main street of the town he thought he owned, brought down by a lone cowboy, a brave Apache woman, and a piece of paper that told the truth. Justice had finally come to redemption. The aftermath was swift. The townspeople, their fear broken, took matters into their own hands. They locked Croft and Sheriff Bodine in the town's own jail cells to await the arrival of the U.S. Marshal. The balance of power and redemption had shifted for good. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows down the main street, Jace and Naya stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. It was quiet again, the violence of the day already beginning to feel like a distant dream. "You did it," Nia said softly. "You gave these people their town back. You got justice for your father." Jace looked down at the town, then back at her. "We did it," he corrected. "I never could have done it alone." He looked at her, at the strength and courage in her eyes, and he knew that his days of riding alone were over. He had found something here he hadn't even known he was looking for. A purpose, a partner, a home. "What will you do now?" she asked. Jace thought for a moment. The open road called to him, the endless horizon that had been his only companion for so long. But it didn't hold the same appeal anymore. "I reckon," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "that this valley is a pretty good place to stop wandering." Nia's answering smile was like the dawn. It was a promise of new beginnings, of a future built not on vengeance, but on the foundation of courage and honor they had forged together. The cowboy's promise, made to a desperate woman in a cold lake, had been fulfilled. He had not only restored her dignity, but he had helped save her people, and, in the process, had found his own salvation. In the Wild West, danger came in many forms, but sometimes so did hope. Sometimes it arrived with the courage of a single man, with the fierce love of a mother, with the choice to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. If you believe a single act of honor can change the world, then ride along with us for more stories from the frontier. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story if you believe that justice is always worth fighting for.